Dear Professor, thanks so much for being here. I know how busy you are. And for those who might not know who you are, I would like to introduce you. Well, this is Timothy Snyder. He's an American historian, writer, professor at Yale University, and the ambassador of UNITED24 platform. So thanks again for being here with us. And I would like to start with my first question, which is the following. In your recent interview with Suspilnya, when you were last in Ukraine, you said that the West must do everything possible to ensure that Ukraine wins. This will protect the next generation from the larger war. There are plenty of definitions of Ukrainian victory nowadays, from very pessimistic, if Ukraine remains a state, it's a victory, to the total destruction of Russia as an empire. So what is your opinion? How will our victory look like nowadays, given all the situation?
I think a Ukrainian victory is when Ukrainians believe that they've won, but maybe more importantly, it's when Russians believe that they have lost. Mm-hmm. So Russia has to lose in such a way that it doesn't start another war. So I understand Ukrainians think, first of all, in terms of their victory, but I tend to think in terms of Russia's defeat. They have to be defeated so that they know that they've been defeated. That, for me, is the key thing.
But how exactly would that look like in your vision?
No, but yeah, it's very hard to know what it looks like, because the end of a war is a political thing. There's nothing is purely military. Everything which is military is also political. And in a dictatorial regime like Putin's, you know a war is over when the person who started the war doesn't want to do it anymore. Mm-hmm. Or when he's afraid the war is going to lead to him losing power, or the war does in fact lead to him losing power. So I think the way to think about winning is applying various kinds of pressure to the center of the Russian state. And much of that is on the Ukrainian battlefield, but some of it is also economic, and some of it's also psychological, and some of it takes place inside Russia.
Well, now it physically takes place inside Russia with Kursk operation. What is your opinion on that?
I mean, Americans don't always realize it, but we are very slow thinkers sometimes, and we're very slow actors, and much as we've been on the right side in this war, and much as the people in the White House definitely want the right things and have done some very important things, we've tended to make up some new rules of warfare. Or even worse, we accept rules that the Russians made up, and we somehow treat them as normal. So it's very important that Ukraine cross the border, because when there's a war, when you've been invaded, you're allowed to go back. You're allowed to strike back. International law permits that, and common sense pretty much demands it in a situation like this. So it was important I think it was an important lesson in reality, at least for a lot of Americans, because you cross the Russian border and nothing happened.
Nothing happened, but yesterday was the summit when the UK and the US were supposed to allow Ukraine finally to strike inside Russia, and that did not happen. And a day before, Putin once again threatened that. I actually have this quote. 1 second. He said, "We are not talking about allowing or not allowing the Ukrainian regime to strike Russia with these weapons. We are talking about deciding whether NATO countries are directly involved in the military conflict or not." Basically, again, escalating it and stating that if we get this permission to strike back, it's a war against NATO. So can we say that Russia is basically the threat number one to the world as we know it right now?
I mean, I read that whole thing quite differently. My understanding is that the major victories the Russians are winning in this war are psychological victories, and they're mostly psychological victories in in American heads, in German heads. So I don't connect anything that Putin says to any action that will then follow. What he's trying to do is to get us to do the things that he wants us to do. And really, that's been his only success. I mean, the whole business of nuclear war is there for us to be afraid so that we can act slowly. And our acting slowly is the only thing which has kept Russia in the war. So you can expect him to keep making these kinds of threats. That's totally normal. But he knows perfectly well two things. He knows that it's normal in a war that if you attack a country, they might respond. And he also knows perfectly well that if there was an intercontinental nuclear war, an exchange of ballistic missiles, he would be dead. And he's not going to do that. And we know that too. And there's no reason why we should be more afraid than they should be. This war is a conventional war. It's being fought as a conventional war. And the other important thing here is that, this is actually more important, if you let countries nuclear bluff you, then you're giving them absolute power. If you say Russia can invade Ukraine because it has nuclear weapons and it talks about them, that means Russia can invade Kazakhstan. It also means China can invade Taiwan. It means America can invade Mexico. It means anybody who has a nuclear weapon is allowed to do whatever they want. And that's a much less safe world than the one we're in now, not least because if nuclear bluffing works, then more countries are going to build nuclear weapons, either to carry out nuclear bluffs or to defend themselves against nuclear bluffs.
You visited Ukraine multiple times, also during the war. What did you notice that changed in Ukrainian society, being almost 3 years in a huge war conflict, the biggest one since Second World War?
I mean, most of what's changed. I mean, most of what's changed is very sad. You know, there are fewer people. There are more people who have been killed. There are more people who have been injured. Another thing which has changed is the normality of it all. You know, in 2022, one could believe that it would be over soon, one way or another. After fall 2022, one could imagine that Ukraine might win quickly. It's hard to imagine it ending quickly now, one way or another. A third way, and I'll end with something a bit more positive, is that I think Ukrainians, for the first time, not just in the last 3 years, but really, I've been coming to Ukraine for 30 years. I've been coming to Ukraine for a long time, and it's the first time that I think Ukrainians are beginning to understand how good they are at things. I think one of the bits of Ukrainian national character is a kind of modesty, and it like a sort of humility. And even when Ukrainians are very good at things, you don't really notice because they don't talk about it. But like in my field in culture, the last 10 years have been extraordinary, and then the war years have also been extraordinary. The poetry and the prose of the war has been extraordinary. And there are a lot of marvelous Ukrainian journalists, and Ukrainian culture in general. I mean, Ukrainian textiles, all sorts of fields in culture have gone really well. And in fighting the war itself, right, you had certain kinds of help for sure, but an awful lot of things Ukrainians had to figure out for themselves, and an awful lot of things Ukrainians had to make for themselves, and an awful lot of things Ukrainians have had to repair for themselves. And they've done all of that. And I think now there's a bit more awareness that in this world where, you know, there have always been Poles and Germans and Russians and so on, in this world, we Ukrainians are actually capable of doing a lot of things. That I think Ukrainians now take for granted in a way that maybe they didn't 3 years ago.
Yeah, well, what you mentioned about modesty, I think this just the direct, aftermath of being under Russia, and I have a question about that. Putin often uses history to justify the invasion, depicting Ukraine as a byproduct of greater Russian empire. He repeats the same justification time and time again in the interview with Tucker Carlson also. So how did he manage to convince not just Russia, not just his inner circle, but even the West of his version of history?
Yeah, that's a great question. I'm going to answer it as a historian. I think I'm going to say it. I think history is really important. I think if we don't teach kids history, if we don't teach history seriously at university, then there's a big vacuum, right? There's just a big empty space. And then any dictator can come along and fill that space. Putin does this quite well. Other people do it too. We don't know anything about the past, and therefore someone tells us a fairy tale, someone tells us a story, a myth, and we believe it. Second reason is that this version of history which Putin is telling, although his version is, his particular telling of it is quite brutal and simplified, and particularly idiotic. It comes from Russian imperial historiography of the 19th century, and this basic story about about Vladimir and the baptism and da 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 da. That basic story has been taught in universities across Europe and North America for almost 100 years. And so if anybody knows anything about Russia, they've probably read a textbook which has, again, a more subtle version of what Putin says. But the idea that something called Russia began 1,000 years ago because someone called Vladimir got baptized, but somehow also Ukraine and Belarus, and somehow nothing has changed since then. Like that basic thing was an imperial story which was spread well beyond Russia, well before any of us were born. That's the second reason. Like we haven't taught history, and history is important not just for knowing facts, right? Like it's important to know that the Rus were Scandinavians. It's important to know that the man that you'd like to call Volodymyr or Valdemar had a very complex life. It's important. It's important to know that many things happened on these territories well before Rus, and many things happened on these territories well before Russia. It's important to know things, but it's also just important to know how to be critical. And if you don't know history, you don't know how to be critical of someone else's story, you just kind of tolerate it. But then when you tolerate a story like this, you're tolerating the idea that a really existing people who are on the planet doing things, that they somehow shouldn't exist because they don't fit the story, right? So like you can't tolerate that sort of thing. You have to be critical, but to be critical, you have to have practice in being critical.
But do you notice any like tendencies in the way the history is being taught now, like in Europe or in states, like Ukrainian history? Is anything changing?
It's changing fast. I mean, this is another thing which has changed. It has to do a little bit with modesty. Maidan helped a little bit, but the war has helped a lot. Like Ukraine has become a normal European country. Like I think it's misunderstood now at similar levels to other European countries.
Yeah.
Like you've entered this kind of European community of misunderstanding where like each European country knows a little bit about its neighbors. I think you're now kind of normal. That like but I think that's reassuring. Like I think you belong to this group now where no educated person would now say, oh, I don't have to know anything about Ukraine. There's no such place as Ukraine. That has really changed. But history teaching moves really slowly because somebody has to write a book. Somebody has to write a textbook. Yeah, somebody has to revise the textbooks. So it takes 5 or 10 years for these things to actually cycle through. I'm gonna plug something else now. I'm doing another big project called Ukrainian History Global Initiative, along with about 90 colleagues, most of them Ukrainians, for the next 3 years, which is about producing a big, accessible history of these lands and peoples, and hopefully that will help with this problem.
Given these terrible similarities with how events developed in the Second World War, I mean, with invasion of Poland by Germany, same things kind of happens now in Ukraine. And how far are we close even to the World War III, and what to do, the most important to prevent it?
Yeah, I mean, the way that I see this is that this is a conflict on the scale of a world war. The casualties are on the scale of a world war. The only real comparisons for wars this big in Europe are the First and Second World Wars. And the terrain in question is also roughly the same. So that Ukraine was very important in the First World War, and it was absolutely central to the Second World War. But so the curious thing is that it's a world war in which only one country is fighting. And those of us who are not fighting, I think, should see it that way. And rather than saying, oh, Ukraine has a war and that's a problem, we're worried, we should rather say Ukraine is doing all this by itself. They're holding off something much worse, which is the second way that I see this analogy. So if I were going to use an analogy, it would be Czechoslovakia in 1938. And you're Czechoslovakia. You're an imperfect democracy in Eastern Europe. You have a complicated history, complicated politics, but you're a democracy and things are basically going in the right direction. And then you have a neighbor who says you don't have a right to exist, your nation isn't really real, your leaders are corrupt, I have the right to invade you. That's what Germany says about Czechoslovakia in 1937 and 1938. That's what Putin says about you. The difference is that Czechoslovakia didn't resist. If they had resisted, things might have been very different. And you did resist. And since you resisted and you're still fighting 2.5 years in, that means that you're keeping us in 1938. And 1938 is not a great time, but it's better than 1939, and it's better than 1940 or 41 or 42. So you're keeping, so like, if we think about the analogy in terms of place, it's that it's a world war, but one country is fighting it. If you think about it in terms of time, I think by your efforts, you're keeping us all in 1938. I think about this all the time. I think about how, okay, people in California or in Ireland or in Sicily or whatever are just living their normal lives, like in 1938. Like, sure, there's stuff that they're afraid of and they might talk about it, but they just get to live their normal lives because you're keeping us there. And so the idea would be to like, stop it. Stop, like, get to a situation where you stop this, like this world war is won on these terrains because we understand what the stakes are.
Yesterday, actually, Mikhailo Fedorov called you the most efficient UNITED24 ambassador. So how come it is so important to you, and how come you're so productive?
Okay, first of all, and you can cut this part of the interview, but you guys hugely exaggerate how much I do, because much of what is done is, of course, done by members of the team behind the scenes, right? I mean, occasionally you prop me up and I do something, but most of the fundraising work is actually done by your team. So now you can cut that if you want. Okay. But it's true.
I don't think we will cut it.
Okay. And so then the second thing is that it's important for me because, look, there's this horrible war, and then there are people out there in the world who really want to do something, but they don't know how, and they don't know who to trust, and they don't know what channel to act through. So what United24 does with its ambassadors is it says, hey, look, here are some people who you might like or you can trust. Here's Imagine Dragons, here's Brad Paisley, here's Mark Hamill, here's Tim Snyder, and they're going to show you something that you could do, right? And in that way, people can do something, feel like they're doing the right thing, and the thing they're doing is consequential, right? The stuff that Mark Hamill does is consequential. It actually makes a difference. I like to think that our drone project and our demining project is consequential. It actually makes a difference. So you're linking up this country with the rest of the world. You're linking up people here with people elsewhere who want to help, and you're making a bit of a difference in the war, or you're making people safer during the war. That's why it's important to me. It's honestly, it's making the connection, because when people give, like when an American gives $5 or $50 to United24, it's, the money is important, but it's also, they think, okay, like now I've done the right thing today, and I'm doing it along with other people, right? I'm doing it along with this guy I admire, but also I know I'm doing it along with 100 other people or 1,000 other people. And so that little bit of solidarity, like people want, there are good people who want to do something, but they like to know they're doing it with other people, and that it's actually serving some specific purpose, which we can explain. And you guys make that possible. So that's what you do.
Thanks so much for this answer, for what you do, and hopefully sometime when we have more time, we can speak more. Thanks.
Okay, thanks a lot.